All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kathleen Smith. I'm an associate faculty member at the Bowen Center, and welcome to our second professional lecture of the year. And tonight, just to go over a couple of logistical things before I introduce our guest, is just a reminder to keep yourself muted during the presentation and discussion. We will leave time for a Q&A at the end of the evening. And so when we do that, you can use the raised hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen and wait to be called on, and you can share your thinking or your question with us at that time. I think that's it logistics wise. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. Michelle Brofman. She is a writer and teacher, and her debut novel, Washing the Dead, which I've read, it was a wonderful novel, was included in Book Riot's list of 100 must-read books about women and religion. Her second book, Bertrand Court, features stories that have won numerous awards, including a special mention in the Pushcart Prize anthology, and her essays and short fiction have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Slate, LitHub, Tablet, The Nervous Breakdown, The Forward, and elsewhere. And Michelle teaches fiction writing at the Johns Hopkins Masters in Writing program, and she also founded the Glen Echo Workshops, where she leads monthly multi-genre workshops, and she also teaches summer college essay writing classes. And she also is a systems thinker. And her latest novel, I need to mention, Swimming with Ghosts, which I think she's going to talk about this evening, came out earlier this year in the summer. And I'm going to turn it over to our faculty member, Priscilla Friesa now, who knows Michelle much better than I do, to give you a little bit of intro. And she's going to be part of the discussion as well tonight. So Priscilla, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you so much. This is a very special, fun evening, I think. I'm delighted to be here with Michelle. She actually invited me to be her kind of in exchange an interviewer, if you will, a conversation with her about her writing. I'm delighted. I've had a chance. I've known her since 1992. I would say as with many of the people that I consult to, I learn a lot. And I particularly I've learned a lot from Michelle about writing and about how being a self in writing, it's a whole different methodology than I certainly come by naturally. And I've appreciated her expanding my thinking about how writing contributes to differentiation of self. This evening, we're going to have somewhat of an exchange. I'm going to go ahead and suggest that Michelle kind of begin with her kind of an introduction, and then we'll proceed to more of a conversation. So Michelle, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Kathleen and Priscilla, and of course for inviting me to speak here tonight at this lecture series. So this is actually my second visit to the Bowen Center professional lecture series. I came, as Kathleen said, mentioned my first book, Washing the Dead. I came here to speak, and it was actually in person at the Bowen Center, and was in 2015. And I just really appreciated the chance to talk and think about my writing and that particular novel in the context of Bowen Theory, as well as I had a chance to express my gratitude for the contribution of both the theory and Priscilla, my guide and interpreter of all things family systems. Tonight, as Priscilla said, we're actually talking together. We're going to be in conversation, and having any conversation with Priscilla, we've been kind of chatting a little bit leading up to tonight, and it's akin to what Raymond Carver, the author, said about writing. It's an act of discovery. So I'm going to fasten my seatbelt and see where she takes us. Before we start talking, let me just back up a little bit and describe how Bowen Theory has informed my career as a storyteller. I'm a systems thinker, as Kathleen said. Before I started writing fiction, I produced television documentaries. And this was back in 1992, shortly after I'd been introduced to Bowen. It was actually 93, I guess, before I'd been introduced to Bowen Theory. So Bowen Theory and this new career as a storyteller both arrived in my life in tandem. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. So amidst the if it bleeds, it leads culture of television, I seized an opportunity to tell stories about families who had endured some kind of profound rupture in their life. And my subjects were Vietnamese and Salvadoran refugees, Holocaust survivors, and I soon discovered that applying the very basic principles of Bowen theory, and I say basic because I find this theory so complex yet elegant, and my understanding of it just keeps growing, as does my understanding of how much more I need to learn about it. But at that point, it really helped me see who my subjects were in the context of their families, in the context of a larger social system, and help me understand kind of the nature of their cutoff, and in turn construct their narratives as agenda free as you can as a television producer. And this neutrality became my trademark. And ironically, it also kind of marked me as a producer with heart. So that was kind of an interesting paradox. So I continued to rely on Bowen theory when I began writing fiction in like probably the mid to late 90s. And in addition to working with Priscilla, I just wanted to, so fascinated by the theory, I wanted to learn as much as I could on my own. I devoured Extraordinary Relationships by Roberta Gilbert, Peter Teitelbaum's anthology, Emotional Cutoff, Bowen Family Systems, Theory Perspectives. And in over preparing for today's talk, which is what I do, I perused the Bowen Center website again and just kind of went back through some of these books that had informed my early thinking about storytelling. And I was struck again by how calming I find Bowen theory and the relief of being able to look at something in terms of a system and eliminate this kind of good guy, bad guy presentation that we see in so many of our cultural narratives. And I also was struck by how much this theory has informed my approach to relating to the characters who people my real and fictive worlds. So for example, in all of my fiction and my memoir writing too, I aspire to write what I call no fault fiction. And I made this term up, and it's funny because I teach at Johns Hopkins, and I had one of my colleagues say, where did you get this term, no fault fiction? All my students are talking about no fault fiction, and where does that come from? And I'm so happy that it had made its way throughout the program. But I love it because it's the basic, the sweet spot for me and what I want to achieve in my fiction is this place where the reader understands every single character's place in a story or in a system, and where you're just really rooting for them all. And as I said, there are no good guys, there are no bad guys. You're feeling for all of them, even if they're doing egregious things. So my new novel, Swimming with Ghosts, my characters behave very, very badly. I'm going to talk about this book tonight, and I want to give you a little background. The book was set amidst the backdrop of a Northern Virginia community swim league. And I know we have people from all over the world here today. So I will just tell you that the community swim league in Northern Virginia, and we have one in Maryland where I live, it consists of a lot of community neighborhood pools that compete in a league every summer. And the seasons are about 6 to 10 weeks. And it's supposed to be just fun. The stakes are very, very low. And the anxiety is very, very high. And so as a writer, I just couldn't resist, kind of diving in, so to speak. So my family also we belong to this pool. We spent 14 summers tethered to one of these local community pools. My two kids swam and coached. I organized the meets. My husband was the announcer. We never planned a vacation for the summer. During the months of June or July, we were that family. For like 8 to 10 weeks, we just crawled into this adrenaline pumping cocoon of summer swimming. It's kind of surreal. It's kind of magic. It's kind of culty. We were in. So early in our family's foray into this surreal swim world, I noticed a very odd and disturbing intensity surfacing in myself. It was very unattractive. And I started to think, what is with me? Why am I getting so worked up about these ridiculous little, is kid going to be in a relay? Or, I mean, it's embarrassing. You'll have to trust me. And I was thinking, we were in Division H. I mean, really, the stakes couldn't have been any lower. But, it wasn't just me. And not, I mean, it was me. And this book has a lot of satire. I'm owning my part in it. But it was just there was that feeling among the other parents in the pool too, an incredible amount of intensity. And we were not differentiated. We had it was a very anxious system. And it started me thinking like, well, what is the specific nature? What is this about? What are we bringing to the pool? What unresolved issues do we have in our own lives? Like what's going on here? And how is this affecting the way, I mean, there was a lot of magic, but there was also a lot of tension between people as well. And what's that about? And that is how most of my fiction starts. I'll have a question that makes me uncomfortable and about my own behavior, or I'll be in a system where I'm uncomfortable, where there's a lot of anxiety. And my instinct is to parse the emotional system of a community, as I had with my own family when I was trying to kind of, worked on some of my own family issues way back. So I also wanted to give myself, it's like writing about it and kind of figuring this out. And this telling a story gives me distance, it gives me altitude and a little more flexibility. And I wanted that because I was in my kids' world. One of my favorite novelists, David Grossman, describes a certain kind of writing that deals with explosives that can change a reader's life, and you can change and you should change, I think, your own life. And it's probably dramatic to say that about a book set in a summer pool, but the act of kind of working through, really trying to figure out all the triangles, it is life-changing and it does give me distance. And there are things that I learned that I take with me. So I just felt that compulsion. Like Joan Didion talks about things that have a shimmer, and I felt like this particular place had a shimmer. And so that's kind of what drew me to this particular community. But the book didn't start as a novel. I didn't know I was going to write a novel, but wanted to write about this community. So I started to write short stories. I wrote 4 short stories, each from a different characters. Yeah, I have 4 narrators, and each narrator narrated one of my short stories, and they later became published. And I was thinking, okay, maybe that's it. And maybe I just needed to write some short stories, short fiction. But I kind of fell in love with this crew, and I was thinking about them all the time, and I was pondering, who they were and who they were to each other, and what the pool meant to them, and what in their family history, who they were, was kind of creeping into their present life and getting them into trouble. I want to know their family secrets, all their multi-generational, these forces that were shaping them as parents and as people. And I would talk about them. I had one friend in particular, and we would just talk about them all the time. If you had been sitting next to us in a restaurant or something, you would have thought like that they were real people, because we just discussed them constantly. And as I got to know them, I realized that the issue, I know that they're not real. I just want you to know that I know that. But I realized that the issue that they were grappling with, this multi-generational force, was addiction. And the ghosts in the book, Swimming with Ghosts, was this patriarch who was an alcoholic. And I wanted to explore how that had kind of, was affecting the family. So I was noodling on this, and then the derecho hit. And the derecho is a very fast and furious storm. Some of you local folks probably remember it. It was June 29th, 2012, and it kneecapped the Washington metro area. We were out of power for days, and there's a lot of destruction, and trees fell. And most people who live in the DC area have some kind of derecho story. No AC, and it was really hot, and it was kind of like the ultimate disruptor, and it really threw everyone off their game. And that's what you want in fiction. You want people off their game. You want to see who they are when their world, the ground is kind of quaking beneath them. And a derecho is also the quintessential perfect storm. You have to have a certain number of days of humidity and heat and barometric pressure for it to hit. So it was also, a great literary device, because that's what you want in a book, a perfect storm. Like, why is this summer different from all other summers? All of these specific factors conspire to create havoc, to create a storm. And so it worked in both of those ways. It was very destabilizing. So what I want to do next is just introduce you to the pool and to the characters, read a little bit from the book, and then we can talk more. Priscilla and I will talk more about the book and Bowen theory and writing and whatever, we'll see what comes up. Okay, so before I read this little passage, I want to introduce you to Jillian Cloud, and she was one of my 4 narrators. She was one of my short story narrators as well. And her history with this fictitious pool, which is called River Run, runs very, very deep. She grew up in the pool. She's now the queen bee mom. Everybody knows who the queen bee kind of person is. And she really is not able as an adult to let go of this sacred place, because it's where of her childhood, it was the one place her father did not drink or didn't get very, very drunk. So she's holding on to this dearly. Her father, Sebastian Norton, this mythic kind of figure. And then Jillian's best friend is Christy Weinstein. And this summer, she learns a piece of stunning, startling information about her family history, and it threatens her sobriety. She has been a love addict in repose. I wouldn't say in recovery, more like in repose. Jillian's husband, Charlie, is kind of lethargic. He loses his job. He decides to step in and coach the team when the old coach quits a week into the season, and it energizes him, and he becomes fit, and the kids adore him. He has some kind of awakening. And this really disrupts the ecosystem, because this was Jillian's place, and all of a sudden Charlie's here, and he's getting all this attention, and she's kind of edged out, so she's off her game. And then Justin is Jillian and Charlie's son, and he's an assistant coach, and he's a lifeguard, and he's kind of like the Nick Carraway character in Great Gatsby, where he just sees everything, and he's just watching these adults behave, get kind of kooky. So I'm going to give you this is a little passage I'm going to read, and it's a flashback. It's from Jillian's perspective, Jillian the queen bee. And it's from when she was 11 years old. This is a flashback, and you kind of get a sense of the pool and who her father was. And I'd say the book kind of hinges on this scene in a way. Jillian had been dreaming of checking in members in the lifeguard office, but she didn't think it would happen until she turned 12 at the earliest. She touched the Bic pen wrapped in masking tape, etched with "Property of River Run Pool" in red letters. No pen was going to disappear on her watch. Today, she would be the one writing the dates down on the family's assigned index cards, and oh my gosh, keeping track of guest passes. 1 hour into the job, Jillian's parents and brother came to say hi. Dad's new camera dangled from his neck as he raised his cigarette to his lips. He leaned toward Jillian and whispered, "I'm proud of you." To her relief, his breath smelled only like cigarette smoke and plain coffee. Jillian melted into her father's praise. "Thanks." "Look who's here," Dad said, and he and Mom ran off to snag chairs right next to Mr. and Mrs. Spillman. Jillian watched Mr. Spillman reach into his cooler and hand Dad a bottle of beer. She stuck her hand in her pocket and felt for the rabbit's foot she'd won last summer for making every single swim practice. She stroked the fur 15 times. Maybe she could make Dad stop at one beer. A few hours later, she heard voices swell from the pool area. Kids were chanting, Mr. Norton, Mr. Norton. Go and look, the head lifeguard said. Your dad is the man. You know that, right, Jillian? Jillian stepped away from the desk and passed her buddies on the way to her family's spot at the far end of the diving well. The sun had eaten up most of the early afternoon shade. Jillian stood between her brother and her mom, who was chewing on a nail she'd polished pastel pink only yesterday. She picked up her father's camera and pressed the viewfinder to her eye, tracking Sebastian Norton as he rose from his seat. He took a long drag on a cigarette, picked up a stray beer bottle, and jammed the butt into its mouth. He tightened the tie of his trunks and winked as the swimmers chanted his name. Dad approached the diving board and started his climb. The chanting grew to a roar. Swan dive, swan dive. When he reached the last rung, Jillian held both her and her mother's breath as his foot wobbled. Even the loudest little kids quieted down. He stood on the rear of the board and gazed at Jillian. For a second, she thought she'd get in trouble for using his camera without his permission. But instead, he yelled, Get this, baby girl, his faint slur likely unnoticeable to anyone but a Norton. I will, she mouthed. Jillian prayed. She asked God to wrap his arms around Sebastian and guide him into the water so he wouldn't hit his head on the board and die. She prayed for Mr. Spillman to run out of beer, for the family to head home before her father started wanting something stronger, and for her mom to designate Jiffy Pop Saturday, where they would eat popcorn and then play Monopoly. She pushed the camera harder into her eye socket, trying to sense when Dad would start his dive. The sun beat down on his broad brown shoulders as he strode across the board with great purpose. Jillian's heart pounded so hard she thought it might rattle the pen she tied around her neck. He jumped once, twice, 3 times, and on the 4th bounce, he raised his hands over his head and leaped into the air. In that split second, Jillian moved back far enough to capture him in his glory, his long arms spread like Jesus on the cross, and his lips split open into a grin practically spanning the width of the pool. But she stood close enough to edit out the beer bottles around his empty chair. Click. Dad's entry was perfect. God had listened to her. So as I said, a lot of the novel kind of hinges on this scene because the relationship between this patriarch and Jillian and the rest of his children is really such a big part of the narrative. And it also sets up the question, which evolved as I was writing the book, can we transcend our most painful family legacies? That's really what I wanted to explore. And I think the answer is yes. And that's what's interesting to me as a writer and a person, our ability to grow and to heal. And it's not an exaggeration to say that my desire to differentiate within the many systems and in turn to function better as a mother, wife, teacher, daughter, sister, writer is intrinsically linked with my drive to tell stories. I believe that through storytelling, autobiographical and fiction, we can script a self and bridge cut off. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for that elaborated introduction. I want to pick up on exactly what you're talking about. One of the things that struck me in these years knowing you and being through a number of these projects with you is there's been this parallel between what's going on in your family and what you're kind of working at and what you're working at in your professional life, in your creative life. And I wonder if you would speak to that a little bit over time, what this process has looked like, because it's almost as if each book has answered something. You've learned something about your family, about yourself, and about theory, I guess I would say. I'm interested in what your thoughts are.
Well, it's not something that's conscious because I can't, if I tried to do that,
Yeah.
it wouldn't work. And I think it would end up being like really you know, it could end up, the story could end up just being very theoretical, and or it would look like a case study. But I'll tell you, when I'm writing something, when I come up with an idea, and it's usually, you know, like with this, if there's some kind of um, system that I want to explore, then as I'm trying to figure out what's going on in my book, I'm just applying every single thing that's happening to me during my life. And it doesn't matter. I could write a book set in, you know, Alaska in the 1900s, and the same thing would come out. So it really is a way for me to process my world and whatever is going on in that particular moment. And then by using these characters and trying to figure out, like with Washing the Dead, I was trying to figure out, really exploring, like, what does forgiveness look like? And having my character forgive her mother, I learned so much about, how that works, how you forgive a family member, how bridge cutoff, all that kind of thing. So it's really a process that as I said, like the two tracks kind of go side by side, but I'm not always so conscious of how that works.
So when you think about this book, present book, The Swimming with Ghosts, what would you say, what are the Bowen theory ideas that are prevalent in this book?
Well, what I wanted to explore was the multi-generational ripples of addiction, which we've talked about as being like one particular expression of anxiety, and how that looked within this particular family, and how it played out in terms of the relationship between these narrators. So that was something that I relied on, pretty heavily. And then also in looking at this family that I created, what helps me is, we're just looking at all the different triangles and how people are relating to one another. And also a triangle, looks different in a calm situation than it does when the anxiety is really high, when the waters are high, so to speak. So the other thing that I thought about writing this book constantly is, okay, who are these people? What is going to stress the system? The storm, the storm's a metaphor, but there were other things I keep asking myself, as any fiction writer does, what is going to stress the system? What is going to reveal these characters in their essence and their most anxious? So that's another thing I think about as well in terms of the Bowen context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was always interested in is you would come in and start talking about your characters and talk about the emotional math.
Yeah.
You wanted to make sure the math was right. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What were you working at?
Well, part of it was to figure out who my characters were in the moment. I realized this when I was writing short fiction. I started writing short fiction before I wrote novels. And I wanted to, when I was creating plots or trying to figure out what the tension was, I realized very quickly that I needed to work on a much bigger canvas than a short story. I wanted to know what was going on, cut 2 or 3 or 4 generations up. I had to know that if I was really to understand what the source of my character's trouble was. And so that's something that was, I would think of that as the math in terms of all the different triangles that were kind of surrounding this particular character. And it's like a more maybe geometry, but that was really important to kind of, and that has become, the characterization, I think, is one of my, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses as a writer. And I think that that's probably one of my strengths, and most of it a lot of it has to do with Bowen theory and just really trying to understand these bigger systems, because that gives my character depth and breadth.
So I wanted to get back to this linking between your own life and what you're working out that happens to be working something out that you don't know about yourself through this method. So I guess what I was I was curious about is you were telling me, I think when we were kind of preparing for this story about being on a book tour and having information that was about your own family you did not know. Could you tell that story, or do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, I think that for me, I think it was Eudora Welty said, you write what you don't know, you know. And we talked about this as well in one of our chats earlier in the week, this whole idea of, I said, what's that about? How does that even happen? So here's an example of writing what you don't know, you know. This is a story I told. So basically, that you just heard the excerpt when you see this Sebastian Norton character diving off of the board and the whole swan dive and everything. And so I was at a family gathering and my sister-in-law said, oh, well, your mother used to tell the story of her father, this one story all the time. And this was like, in the drafting of the book, it was not published yet. And I was and we were in this family gathering, I was sitting next to my daughter. And the one story she told all the time was that he sent my mom to summer camp, and he was this charismatic doctor, and he would come in once a summer, and he would come in it was in northern Wisconsin, he'd fly in from Milwaukee on a seaplane. And all the little girls would be sitting there at the side of the beach watching him come, like basically swan diving in the seaplane and landing in the water. And so my daughter turned to me and said, oh, he was Sebastian Norton, the guy we just read about. Like, what? I mean, it's like, that's not what I meant. I had no plan. I wasn't thinking to myself. And my grandfather also had some characteristics with Sebastian Norton. He had some substance abuse issues. He was just very charismatic. He would have been the guy everybody was clapping and chanting his name. So I thought, oh, that's the story. And then I went on a book tour and I was in Chicago, and my mother's summer camp friends, this was last week, they came to the event. These were her camp counselors, and their daughters were there too. And I told the seaplane story. And one woman who was her counselor started getting really teary. And she raised her hand and she said, I was there. I saw that seaplane. And then she said, but there's a part of the story you're not telling. And the part of the story that you're not telling is when he landed, he opened the door of the plane, he stepped on the wing of the plane, and he dove into the water. And she said, even as a counselor and as a young girl, I thought that's kind of dangerous because it's pretty shallow. But that was that whole kind of notion of someone, I mean, I don't know if I need to unpack it. Like the little, that edgy, risky kind of behavior. But, and I couldn't even go on. I had to take a minute because how could I have known that? And I asked my dad, I said, because he'd heard this story over and over. And thank God he's still living. He said, no, I never knew that part of the story. She never said that.
Interesting.
How do you know how would you explain it? You had a really good take on that, how you end up with these stories. Yeah. I mean, I think fiction does that. Fiction takes you to these places, but you had a thought on it.
Yeah, I was thinking there's something in the emotional system that is your system, that is your writing. You are writing your system. So it's hard. Things like that would emerge, would seem like that's maybe how it works. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to pick up on this because this to me is a little bit of an example. As you, again, what I have thought of as when I think about you as in some ways using writing as in addition to making contact with family and connecting with family, doing that, the methodology you use to really understand and see the system is writing. And I've understood that when I think you've mentioned that if you're not writing, you're off. Something's off. So can you talk a little bit about that? Kind of how is that methodology a part of your differentiation of self? How do you think about it?
Well, it's such a good time to ask me because I'm not writing and I'm really off. So I can tell you exactly how I'm feeling. um, I think that, looking at the world through a Bowen lens is, as I said, it surprised me how calming it was. I mean, even now, like with everything going on in the world and everything, just kind of applying this paradigm to whatever's happening with me, with the larger social system, it's very, very calming. And when I'm doing that and I'm exercising my brain in that way, it puts me in a thinking phase. It puts me in a thinking space. It makes me more neutral. It makes me more compassionate. Because it's like no fault fiction. I can see everybody and where they're stuck and how a system might be, people might be undifferentiated. Like I can see it through that lens. And so it just makes me in writing it is just like anything else. If you teach, maybe it's the same thing. Like if you teach something, you understand it better. So I think it's one thing to think about it with my family, but then if I start to apply everything to this fictional world I'm creating, it almost cements it in. It makes I can go deeper and I understand it better. And that in turn makes me very calm or much calmer.
So then how does it affect who you are in the relationships in your family?
Well, if I can script a differentiated person, then I know what that looks like. I know what that feels like because I've written someone who's differentiated or who's trying to differentiate. And also just the act of writing and doing exactly what I just said. It's my world. It's how I see things. And that also gives me a sense of self with my family. I don't worry about, oh no, what's cousin so-and-so going to think of my book? Or they're going to like it or they're not going to like it. It's like, there's an act of just speaking my truth that I find helps me definitely create a sense of self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to also ask you, you are, I had two questions. One, I wanted to kind of get at this. One of the things you talked about this novel is also the bigger system, the family system and the system, let's say in this case, the swim group. How have you thought about your ideas expanding to larger systems, the community, the bigger national, international? We were talking about this given the Israeli and Hamas thing, what you were thinking about it, given where you are with your writing and things.
Well, I mentioned that when I was going through this Peter Titleman book, that we talked about the fact that there's this essay at the end of it, this article by Fran Ackerman, is that her name? Mm-hmm. Israeli-Palestine Relations, a Bowen Theory Perspective. So I haven't read it yet, but oh my goodness. I think what's, even back to when I was working on the documentaries and I was really looking at communities, it was interesting to me to apply some of the systems thinking to looking at not just and how an individual had been, a refugee, but like who they were in their family and who they were in a bigger community. And I think that that's, a lot of the principles that apply to my own family, I apply to this fiction world I create. And, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I can apply it to, that's the whole idea. Right. In the lecture series too, I can apply it to, the community I live in, or a job, or I work for Johns Hopkins, a big institution. I can just take a lot of these ideas that I've learned and apply them to various systems, small and small and big, just to help me understand. And the question that I'm interested in now is, I'm trying to understand how the derecho happens, like literally and metaphorically. And now what I'm really interested in is more of like how to bridge that cutoff, because all of my books and my stories have kind of pointed toward this thought of, like, how does this happen? How does the storm happen? But now what I'm really interested in is the cleanup
That's
and
your
bridge
next
and the
book.
bridging. Oh, thanks for asking. That's my next
That's a
book.
bridge. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's my next book.
Okay.
What does that look like? And then I think about that in terms of this, these bigger, and bigger, like almost like the Russian dolls, like the bigger communities and universes.
Yeah. So the other thing that you do is teach.
Yes.
And I've been interested, particularly the things you've reported about working with young people as they are writing their essays, college essays. I've been interested, maybe you can talk a little bit about what your Bowen Theory training contributes to your teaching writing.
Well, I was actually going to say this when we were talking about scripting a differentiated person, writing that is almost like if you can write it, you can almost be it maybe. So I am going to answer your question, but I was thinking about that also in terms of the college essay kids that I work with every summer. A lot of them are writing about, these moments. They can be challenging moments or moments of insight, or if there's getting to know themselves through the writing process like I do. And I teach them kind of how to do that and guide them through that. And I say, this is, if you're writing about a challenge that you overcame, it's a message in a bottle that you're going to pick up later when you get to college. Let's say you write about having trouble at the lunch table. I mean, whatever it is that they're writing about. Then all of a sudden you go in a dorm, you don't know anybody, and you can go back and read that essay and say, oh yeah, I know how to do this because I've written it down. And I think there's something about putting these experiences, these challenges into a narrative that's incredibly powerful. And so I wanted to just say that because I think that's I'm teaching that as well in a different way, obviously. But in terms of Bowen theory, I think the way it informs, oh my gosh, it's hard to say because I think so much of it I've just naturally kind of, it's become ingrained. But like the way I run a workshop, my method of building community is just to be as much of a self as I possibly can, and not play favorites. Keep my eye on the ball, make sure we're talking about the story, not get kind of pulled into anyone else's anxiety. And I feel like the calmer I am as a leader, and if I model that, what happens almost very often, and I'm lucky, like most of the time, is that the students they take my lead and they're really calm too, and that allows them to hear feedback and to give feedback in a very positive, nourishing way. So it's really being a self within this group of kids, or whom, I mean, I teach workshops, people all different ages, but I feel like that's very much informed by, by my Bowen thinking, like thinking about my workshop as a system.
So I wanted to pick up on a conversation we had, and you were talking about reading, being a reader for some of your colleagues, and being able to see cutoff in there. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's just really fascinating. What you read in a book, what you pick up, what doesn't work.
Yeah.
As being a writer.
As being what, pardon me?
More about the writer.
Yeah. It happens more in memoir, I think. If I'm reading a memoir and I can, maybe spot, and I'm not alone in being able to do this, but just spot maybe like a blind spot on behalf of the writer. And it comes out in fiction too. So, okay, I'm not like everybody has their superpower as a writer and as a teacher. And I'm not the person who's like, I wasn't an English major, and in terms of my writing, there are people who write beautiful, just the quality of their prose is very, it's just, they're really in touch with the natural world, or they're good with metaphor or whatever. But what I feel like what I can bring to the table as a writer and a reader, and this is really thanks to Bowen Theory, is just to get right down to like, what is the core of what's going on? Or I see cutoff here. I see I see fusion here. I see, where this writer is maybe not really being a self in this particular description. And I can just find that pretty quickly. And I think that's a large part of just studying Bowen Theory, and just like looking at a piece of work through that lens.
So would you say that where you are, kind of picking up on what your next book is, where you are in your own journey has to do with this step of being clearer about what it is to be a self, or to be differentiated? What would you say? How is your next book lining up with who you are and the questions you're addressing in your own life?
Well, I think the first 3 books were more about understanding cutoff. And that's what, Jean-Paul Sartre said, writers write about 2 things over and over and over. And I thought, well, my thing is, ruptures of the soul. And I was really interested in terms of parsing that. How does that happen? What are the factors that combine to lead up to some kind of rupture? Because my family had, like a lot of families, we had these various levels of cutoff in certain generations. And so that was really interesting to me, like how does that all work? And I think now what's interesting to me in this new book I'm working on is, okay, so now what? How do you bridge that? Okay, so I'm writing a sequel to this book, to Swimming with Ghosts. And so we had the big derecho, and all of these relationships kind of were shattered. And now it's up to this next generation. They're going to try to put this family back together. And the narrators are going to be different, but the next generation, they're going to try and like do the work. And what does that look like? That I have not written yet. I've written the suggestion of it, that this is going to be done. So I like my endings. Like that's the final card I'm going to play. I play like there's a suggestion that this will happen. Mm-hmm. But I haven't really scripted that. So scripting this character who could forgive and that was one thing that I mean, I was more the suggestion of her forgiving. Mm-hmm. But scripting a character who's really trying to kind of figure out how to put this family back, like bridging cutoff in all of these different ways. That's really interesting to me, and that's new territory, and I think that's going to be so fruitful.
And you can smell a little bit of that in the end of this book.
Yeah, the suggestion that's going to happen, but people say, oh, how are these people ever going to put their lives together? How are they ever going to repair these relationships?
Yeah.
And that's why I'm writing a sequel, because I go to all these book clubs who say, you're going to write a sequel? And then I would ask, well, what do you want to know? I'm like, well, I want to know how these relationships, what's going to happen to this family? How are they ever going to put themselves back together? So they actually gave me the idea. So, well, who do you want to hear from? And so Jillian, the narrator who narrated the scene that I read, she has a brother, Patrick, who's in recovery, who's also like who's an alcoholic. And he's kind of the family screw up. I love family screw ups. And the one who gets all the attention, who acts out the symptoms, the lightning rod, whatever we want to call them. And so I'm really excited about his role in this book, because he's going to be someone who's going to be very valuable in terms of, piecing this family, helping to piece this family back together.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to write from the point of view of the family, the family lightning rod.
Well, I have another, I'm just looking at the time here. I have another question. One of the questions that you have mentioned, things have mentioned is alcoholism. And in your study of this, or addictions generally, I think I would say more, and how that functions in the togetherness and the fusion. And you have learned a lot from AA and Al-Anon. And certainly Al-Anon is something that's come more directly out of Bowen Theory through Jody Kellerman and his relationship with Dr. Bowen. So I'm kind of interested in how that has informed your treatment in this book and in your thinking yourself.
Well, so my character who relapses is actually not an alcoholic. She's a love addict, which is different from a sex addict because it's all the dopamine hit comes from the attention, from the relationship, from the connection. So, but it's the addiction. I mean, it really could be anything. Could be alcohol, could be Funyuns, could be like whatever. But it comes through the generations. So I really wanted to understand alcoholism and addiction as much as I possibly could. And in Al-Anon, it was really more Al-Anon than AA. I started to really explore that, and it was so familiar to me because that's one of the first things. It's a family disease. That's one of the first things that, they say that over and over. And there was so much of the language about underfunctioning and overfunctioning and how to be a self in an alcoholic system. And it just was very intuitive. And I think that was an interesting layer to writing this book and understanding this specific kind of anxiety. And I felt like that was really a gift to be able to, kind of come at the Bowen theory in a different way through alcoholism.
Through another
very interesting
anxiety mechanism.
Anxiety, yes, managing self. I mean, it's really so much. I mean, the language is slightly different, but not always. Sometimes there's just such a direct overlap. And I thought, well, that was really interesting. And I wanted to look at it as a family disease. I did. I wanted to.
So that was kind
really
of your
important.
field work.
Yeah.
In that case.
Yeah. And I also had people who I talked to. I had a love addict who I consulted with, just to say, okay, how's this? Would her name was Christy? Would Christy do this? And she said, that's exactly what you do. So I had people who I was having as beta readers to check things out as well.
Got you. Well, Michelle, do you have anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure gets said before we open it up for Q&A?
Well, there's something that you said in one of our pre-conversations that I thought was so interesting about building a character and how like the creation of these characters reminded you of how you get to know some of the folks that you work with. And I thought that was interesting. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, that was our last conversation. When you talk about these characters, the descriptions and what's important to you in them is very similar to what I do. That's what I was really struck by in terms of kind of what you focus on and what's important, where are the edges where somebody can make a difference in their life. What are they not seeing? What are they missing? How does cutoff work in the picture? I think that's been the thing that's been interesting to hear, the parallel characters that you're creating. Thanks for bringing that back up.
Yeah. Kathleen,
you want to kind of moderate the Q&A and we'll kind of sit back.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so let's open it up to questions from the audience. If folks can click the raise hand button in the reactions tab, and I will give you an opportunity to pose your thinking to Michelle. Nobody has one right away. I'm gonna steal the opening one, but we've got somebody. Yes, Sandra.
Yes, I wanted to ask Michelle, you mentioned in terms of ruptures, you said one of the things you said was ruptures of the soul in these situations. And I wondered if you could say more about what you mean by soul.
Oh, okay. What I was talking about was really in my first book, Washing the Dead, I talked about ruptures of the soul quite a bit because this was a woman who was torn away from her spiritual community. And so I thought of it in terms of kind of, in that spiritual realm. And in some of my documentaries, I thought of that as well, like people who had really been just yanked out of their country, out of their homeland. It just felt like it was deeper than a physical rupture or even an emotional rupture. It felt like it was a real rupture, like the soul.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Monica?
Michelle, I was really struck by your observation that you can read pieces and see where the author is perhaps not bringing their best differentiated self forward. And as someone who dabbles in writing myself, I often have that unsettling feeling that I'm not doing my best work because I'm holding something back. I'm just wondering, what are the markers that you see or experience, since you also mentioned in your own life when you're not writing, something is not quite settled. And I just wondered if you could say more about that observation.
Sure. And I'm so glad you asked that question because I want to add that I have people who read for me for that very same reason, because I have blind spots. And so I'll go back to my first book, Washing the Dead. This is probably the best example. I was writing from this person's point of view, and it was about the Orthodox community and the practice of separating the men from the women. And my character loved that and felt like such a sense of community with her mother and being with the women. And she thought it was this, it was real, and that got ripped from her. So she was very upset about it. But I had my own feminist ideas about the separated seating. And so I was talking over my character and I couldn't see it. And so people kept saying, why does she care if she is being ripped, if this community is being ripped from her? She's always criticizing it anyway. Like, no, she's so important to her. But it was me, it was my feminist thinking that got mixed into her voice. And that's, I'm using myself as an example because I want to say I rely on my readers all the time. When I start to, something unresolved in me sneaks into the voice of the character. And that happens a lot. And I cannot see it all the time. And that's when I have some of my best aha moments. And as Priscilla was saying, like the growth, like that will just rock my world. Like, oh yeah. And then by the end of the book, I'll start understanding this character's warmth toward sitting with women in a segregated kind of situation. Like it kind of continues to evolve in that way. Does that answer your question?
It really does. Thank you. And it's also interesting. It seems to suggest too, the process of writing, as Priscilla mentioned, is an expression of differentiation or working through systems thinking for yourself, that you're in some ways positioning yourself again and again to honor the integrity of the character as distinct and separate from yourself. And so I appreciated that answer for that too. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's brilliant. Yes, my characters need to differentiate. Yes, that's what needed to happen. Thank you. That's really, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. Thank you, Monica.
Yes, Lynn.
Hey, Michelle. I was thinking as I was listening to you, I use genograms a lot as I'm a family therapist, and I was wondering if you use any of the tools of genogram or lifespan tracking to try to keep track of your stories, because I think about crafting a world like a novel, and the amount of detail that you must have to keep in your head. I know you were talking about, sharing the narrative over coffee with a friend, but I couldn't imagine trying to keep track of everybody without multiple genograms. So I was just wondering if you use any tools like that, or what you use as a author to keep track of the details of your character. Thanks a lot.
Oh my goodness. That's such a good idea. They kind of hang out with me a lot. So I'm always thinking about them. Like, for example, I got pizza with my husband. What would they order? What are they gonna put in their pizza? I mean, constantly thinking about them in that way. But I like that idea, and I want to know more about that. It's a way of taking notes on your. Tell me more about the genogram. What kind of details are you keeping track
Okay.
of?
Yeah, I'd love to recommend, I think it's Monica McGoldrick's book from the 80s, for genograms. And I've just been trained to use them in my graduate program. And there's our family maps, right? The stuff that helps us keep track of relationships and generational connections. I use them with every client I see, and they help me map energy and all kinds of information. So if it's not something that's familiar to you, I'd love for you to just, take that as a suggestion, because for me, it's the only way, talking to hundreds of people, in my career, trying to keep track of the little minute details. And I actually train my clients in a way to kind of think like I do by having a genogram out in my lap every single time I have a session. So yeah, cool. Well, I'd love to share that idea with
I
you
love it. I
in
love
case it's
that.
a useful tool for you. I think there's probably a lot of people on this talk tonight that might also be using genograms in their life and work. So cool. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
answer.
Thank you. That's such a good idea. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. I feel a responsibility as a Bowen Center faculty to just typically at the Bowen Center we use the phrase family diagram. People also use the term genogram as well, Michelle, but maybe that's the one you're more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's my responsibility.
Thank you. No, thank you for saying that. I do know what a family
because
diagram is.
people sometimes use the terms interchangeably, so I thought you maybe were more familiar with that.
Thank you.
Yes,
Good to know.
Janice.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. I'm so enjoying this. I wondered, Michelle, if you have novelists that you think are pretty good at writing about differentiation of self. People that you read that you think, this sounds pretty close.
Yeah. I really well, I think Toni Morrison does a phenomenal job. Probably more writing about what happens when there's not differentiation, but I think that's really instructive too. Alice Munro, I think, does a really good job. Elizabeth Strout, excellent job. James Baldwin, oh my goodness, the best short story I've ever read, having to do with the multi-generational ripples of alcoholism, which is a huge influence on me, was Sonny's Blues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite something. And then the other nonfiction book that I think does a great job is The Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman. Yeah, that's a good, I'll keep thinking. Thank you for asking that.
You probably know John Truby. He's a writer's teacher. Do you know him?
I do not know him, no.
Well, I'm working at writing, and I read him, and he's really helpful. And I swear he says things about writing that make me think he knows a lot about differentiation of self. I don't know that, but it's been really fun to pick that up and the things that he says in his really good books about how to write.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm getting so much good information. I wrote that down. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. Michelle, I'll ask you a question while we wait on other folks. I was just
Okay.
thinking, and this was sort of based on the last comment, is it possible to have a protagonist with too high a level of differentiation? You know, as do people get less interesting as fictional characters the more differentiated they are? You know, none of us have to worry about that in our lives because we all have challenges. But is it,
Yeah.
you know, does it make a character less interesting? I guess how do you think about people's maturity level and you know, when you start them from, you know, from the jump?
That's such a good question. Um, you know, I think it makes them more interesting because even someone who's highly differentiated or evolved or however we want to say it, then it's interesting as a writer to think, well, how am I gonna knock them off of their game? Like there's still ways to take a character like that and give them trouble. And I think in part of, you know, writing fiction is I'm always, you know, you get to know your character so you can figure out what kind of trouble to give them. So in drawing a character who's pretty differentiated, that would be an interesting challenge. What kind of trouble is going to make this person, you know, struggle to regain that equilibrium, even if it is at a higher level? I think if you draw a character who's really, really not differentiated, then sometimes the readers just get so frustrated with that person. And you know, it's hard. It's hard to kind of, because they'll just get so wrapped up in what they don't like about that person, blah, 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 because then their behavior will reflect that lack of differentiation. But that's a really good challenge.
Randy?
Yes, very, very interesting. I was wondering about the question you asked, can we transcend our most painful experiences? And since we're sort of in an age of trauma these days, with all kinds of things being seen as traumatic that folks struggle with, how do you begin to think about the transcending process of painful experiences?
Well, the question was, can we transcend our most painful family legacies? So, but I can answer that. I'll think about that question too, but that was the question of the book. So I guess more specifically, are these descendants of this alcoholic Sebastian Norton ghost character, are they going to be able to turn him from a ghost into an ancestor? Is he going to become a fact of their history, or is he going to continue to rule as he does this particular summer he's summoned? So that's what I was thinking. And in order for them to think of him more as an ancestor than a ghost, meaning someone who you have unresolved issues with, what has to happen? And that's the work of my next book. I don't know that. So, but in terms of can we transcend our own traumas, I guess it's a cousin. They're similar questions, but I think I'd say I'd have an answer that wouldn't differ too much from that. I do think in terms of transcending, what that looks like would be bridging cutoff.
Okay. So it would be sort of changing ghosts into flesh and blood. Something like.
Yeah.
Okay. Real people.
Or factual.
More
Yeah.
factual.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone who's a fact of your family history as opposed to someone who's haunting you.
Okay. Interesting.
Patricia? Or sorry, Randy, I didn't want to cut you off.
Thank you. I'll think about that.
Okay.
Does that address your question?
It does. Yeah, the transcending has to do with thinking of them as people, as real characters, and not as ghosts, having factual information, sort of modifies the power of the past. Something like,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. So that they're not dictating your decisions. It's resolving these old attachments, I guess,
Okay.
that can come through the generations.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patricia?
Thank you, Michelle, for your presentation, and Priscilla for your coordinating this. This is kind of going in a different direction, and I just wondered if you ever wrote about therapist. So as a person who's practiced so often in books and really more in movies, you see a therapist just acting so unprofessionally, and I thought, oh boy, it would be fun to have. It would be fun. It would be wonderful to have really a representative of somebody who represents Bowen Theory, even as a therapist. And I know you've been talking more about the characters, but I just thought I'd throw that out, that I'm always looking for that, and sometimes just cringing when I see the therapists and how they're behaving. So it's just something in my head.
Well, I have not written about a therapist, but that is a good idea. And I too have encountered therapists in fiction that just didn't feel real to me. They also feel like, a lot of times I think what happens is they feel like a device. Like, I want to have my narrator, I want to have them impart this piece of information that they can't impart in any other way. So I'm going to put them in a therapist's office, and then it just doesn't even feels a little staged. But that's a challenge, and I like it. And I'll keep my eyes out for therapists who are presented as they should be.
Well, best of wishes to you, and I can't wait to read your books.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for your question.
Andrea?
Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I
Hi,
enjoyed
Andrea.
I'm so happy to hear you talk about this, and also Priscilla's thoughts about it. And of course, many, many questions. I'm trying to write my own memoir, and I've been working on it 2 years now. And I get more and more stories. So maybe there are 3 books in there, I don't know. But I do find very similar processes to what you're talking about, even though it's not fiction. But when I start to write a memory, then a lot more detail of the memory comes back. Now, maybe I'm making things up too. That's always possible. So I didn't have a video camera for everything.
Right.
So there's a lot of bias in there. But maybe that's what makes it good. But I did find I'm not good with context. Okay. I like to tell stories, but what year it was, what country, I have no idea that that's really important. But many people do tell me that I can't follow your story if I don't have a context. So my reader, Allison, she told me, what about if you divide this up into your long dead family members who you never knew, who come from like the 15th century, whose stories have gone on and on. And then you could have another context, and that would be stories that you hear from other people, indirect. So the indirect, there are a lot of indirect things in terms of maybe even family gossip and what have you that, goes through the system. And then my direct observations, which were full of bias, of course. But still, I think I saw it. And it meant something to me, so I wrote it down because it was important. And then, of course, your nuclear family thing. But I just wanted to tell you about that. And so happy to hear of your struggle. Makes me feel better.
Oh, well, I don't know what will make you feel that better, because it takes me a very long time to write a book. But the thing I wanted to mention, and you're guessing you're aware of this, is there's so many, there's memoir, straight up memoir, but then there's also creative nonfiction, which is another kind of subgenre of memoir. And with creative nonfiction, you can really play. You can, I mean, it's just such a more flexible genre. So you could bring in all of those different voices.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. You don't have to be so straight, worried about sticking to the facts in a specific timeline. So that's something to think about as well.
I probably don't stick to the facts because, my mind goes here and there. But I just said at the beginning of it that, if the people I wrote about were still alive, they'd probably complain,
right.
in my memory. But all I can say is, this is what I remember.
Right.
I think it's pretty good.
Well, it sounds interesting. The 15th century, goodness.
It's just their stories that are captivating. Probably your story about the father with the weakness, is captivating. And how many people have stories like that? I do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a very familiar. You can easily identify with the characters that you're describing and get into the swimming pool with them.
Right. Yeah, it's very.
Yeah.
It's a real escape to do that, to just go into this other world, even if it's memoir, go to another period of time, to go into another community.
Yeah, I've had a ball. Yeah, thank you.
Well, keep going. It sounds great.
Oh yeah, I'm going. I have no choice.
You have no choice, and then you're on to a good thing.
And I have a lot of pictures of Bowen that I wanted to put in there. So, yeah, so that's good too.
Yeah,
I appreciate hearing from you. I feel less alone.
Oh, you're not alone. There are lots of us out there floundering, culling.
Yeah.
Let's have a question for Michelle. If not, oh, we got one. Monica.
Sorry about that. Just one more comment and maybe question. I do appreciate the many questions and aspects of this talk, especially your identification of a disruption as a way to enter a new story. And I think about, there are many ways to characterize a family system disruption. And you described a few, with alcoholism, but also with cutoff. And I more recently, just having experienced death in my family over the last year, have, revisited what does that look like as a family disruption in a different, neutral, objective way as possible. It's not entirely possible right now. And read creative nonfiction by Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking, which now I almost have to go back and read, having heard your talk, because I thought, wow, she did a masterful job of just describing that rumination over the facts, over the details. And I realize now this was a dialogue with herself about herself. Mm-hmm. And searching for those facts were not necessarily getting her closer to an answer, but was certainly helping her progress through whatever grief or triangulation she needed to do to go through the motions for the year after her husband's passing and through her daughter's illness. And so it just occurs to me as I've heard questions about how to keep track of all these details, how to put context together, just the process of systems thinking is in many ways zooming in and zooming out to figure out what part of the story and what details to pay attention to gather any kind of meaning or a story. And in my own writing, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I sometimes get bored with my own story. And I think it's because I've lost track of, looking for those details or connecting those dots in a meaningful way. I've lost interest in some level of zooming and I've lost track of the disruption. Sometimes I've wandered off into the woods of another context and not paid attention to the central disruption of the story. So I found this talk enormously useful for not only thinking about writing, but also about how to continue with Bowen thinking in my own family. So thank you for that.
Oh, sure. You know, one thing about details is that, and this is one of those truths about writing, is that, you know, the more specific, the more universal. That's one of those. It's true. But I think so if you're finding like that you're getting bored or whatever, I mean, the more granular you get, the bigger ideas come forth. It's just one of those things. If you start writing, if you're even journaling and you start writing about, I don't know, blade of grass, like the more detailed you get, the more sensory you get, then that's where all of the symbolism and everything just kind of, you know, comes forward. And so that might be something to keep yourself fresh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mine.
And good luck.
Thank you.
Good luck.
It'd be interesting to have a course on Bowen theory and writing, maybe a workshop.
Yeah. That would be really. Yeah.
I did have one other question for you, Michelle, but I wanted to give other people a chance if somebody didn't get the opportunity and wanted to. But I'm not seeing anybody. You didn't really talk too much about siblings, and I was curious about your process of thinking about how some siblings are involved more, you know, and how the anxiety gets managed in the in the emotional process in the family than others. Who's a more convenient target, I guess. And I didn't know if that's something that you think about when you're sort of sketching out these families and thinking about those siblings. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, because spoiler alert, this really is a sibling novel. And what you know, people ask, oh, what's your origin story? Like, how did this whole thing start? And I don't know. It started in a lot of different ways, but I remember going to a Torah study class and we were talking about Jacob and Esau fighting over the birthright. And I thought to myself in that moment, one day I'm going to write a novel or a story. This was years ago, about two siblings fighting over a birthright. And that's ultimately what happens in this novel. So you've got, it's really looking at this Sebastian Norton character and his children, and how each of them were affected so differently from his addiction. So I was talking about Jillian's brother, Patrick, and he's the one who's kind of the family screw up, but then he ends up going and getting treatment because he has all the symptoms. He ends up going and getting treatment and becomes kind of the healthier person. So I'm really interested in terms of how when I talk about it, anxiety kind of going through a family in a generation, what that looks like on a sibling level and how each person is affected differently. And so that's a very big theme of the book. Very, very big part of it. Do you have anything to say about that, Priscilla?
No, I was just thinking about the book that you've just written and trying not to spoil it.
I just spoiled it. Anyway, there's a big sibling plot, but that's a great question. That's very, and that's a huge part of my sequel too. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. I'll give folks one last chance and otherwise we'll end our time. Yes, Julie.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Got so many more questions to go on, but I was going back to the idea of emotional math you talked about and trying to understand 3 to 4 generations to discover where the troubles come from, I think is sort of how you put it. And you said that gives depth and breadth to your characters. And that made me think about Dr. Bowen talking about if you go back and study, say, a couple from 200 years ago, and then all of their descendants after them, you can do more to grow yourself up than any other exercise you can do. So has that been your experience in writing about this? And you have a sense of growing yourself up in in this through your projects?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. That is one thing that Priscilla is always, if I talk to her about my work, she always wants to know, well, what happened? You gotta tell me what happened a couple generations up. I go, I don't want to talk about that. I have to make all these backstories. So, but that process of thinking about myself or my characters within these 200 years, I don't know if I'm doing 200 years, but within the context of all of these layers and all of these generations, absolutely, that's incredibly centering for me and for my characters as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the work comes from too. I was also telling Priscilla, I do a lot of thinking about who they are. And Hemingway used to, has the iceberg theory where in order to know a character, 5% is above the surface, but you need to know all the 95% that's below. And I think doing that kind of work is really important in terms of, drawing these characters so that I can just give these little phrases here and there about, who my character's descendants might have been. But it absolutely is a factor in my life too. I value that kind of connection and research.
Great. Well,
Thank
the book came yesterday, so
Oh,
I have
that's
some
great.
read. I'll go over Christmas.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
ordering it. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
that.
much. It came quickly, so
That's great. I love to hear
Thank
that. Thank you.
I was just going to add something about the multi-generational history. I think there's creating the cast of characters, and then there's really what happens in the emotional systems of the generations, and the richness that develops with almost a predictability. If this happens here, there is a predictable something. What is it going to be? And I think there's so much energy and life in that, rather than it just being characters in the past. There's so much more substance.
Yeah, that's what gets me excited.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. They have to make sense.
Yeah.
They have to make sense.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us this evening and sharing your thinking. Just a reminder for folks that this will be available on the Bowen Center's YouTube page in case you want to recommend it to somebody or refer to it at a different time. And Priscilla, also thank you for bringing your thinking to this evening as well. We will not have a December lecture. Our next one is going to be in January with Krista Brelsford. And I would also want to refer folks to our clinical conference tomorrow with Amy Post. I think the title is Tango through Transitions with the Thinking Bowen Theory Provides. It should be an interesting day tomorrow as well. I think our staff folks are going to drop that link in the comments. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us
Thank you
tonight.
so much. Thank you, Priscilla and Kathleen, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye.